The sun beat down on the cracked earth of redemption, a town baked into the crimson dust of the Arizona territory. Heat shimmered in waves from the clapboard storefronts, making the distant mesas tremble under a bleached white sky. It was a place where silence was the loudest sound, a heavy, waiting silence that clung to the air like the dust itself. Inside the cool, shadowed interior of Miller's general store, that silence was a welcome reprieve. Jedediah Kane ran a calloused thumb over a tin of coffee, his movements spare and deliberate. He was a man carved from the harshness of the land itself, all sharp angles and weathered quiet. His face was a roadmap of long miles and lonely nights, his eyes the color of a faded blue sky, holding a distance that kept the world at arm's length. For 20 years since the fire, that distance had been his only true companion. He'd been a U.S. Marshal, once a boy with a tin star and a belief in the clean lines of right and wrong. Now he was a tracker, a man who followed trails of dust and blood for coin, a ghost who hunted other ghosts in the wilderness. He gathered his meager supplies, coffee jerky, a handful of .45 caliber cartridges, and placed them on the counter. Silas Miller, the store's proprietor and brother to the town sheriff, gave him a practiced, non-committal nod. In redemption, folks didn't pry. They knew Jedediah Kane lived alone in the hills, that he came to town only when necessity demanded, and that the shadows he carried were his own business. "Storm's comin'," Miller offered, his voice a low rumble. "Feel it in my bones." Jedediah glanced out the grimy window at the cloudless sky. "Sky doesn't agree. Sky doesn't have to live down here." Miller grunted, bagging the items. The words hung in the air, heavier than their meaning. Before Jedediah could reply, the simmering peace of the afternoon was shattered. It started with a shout, sharp and panicked, from across the dusty thoroughfare. Then another. Then the unmistakable, catastrophic sound of shattering glass from the Redemption Bank and Trust. A woman screamed, a raw, piercing cry of terror that cut through the heat. Miller froze, his hand hovering over the cash drawer. Jedediah didn't. He didn't weigh the odds. He simply moved. 20 years of willed solitude couldn't erase a lifetime of instinct. His hand went to the Colt Peacemaker holstered on his hip, the worn leather and smooth walnut grip as familiar as his own skin. He drew the weapon, the motion fluid born of 1,000 violent memories. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and fear, a scent he knew better than his own name. Through the store's window, he saw them, 4 men, bandanas pulled high over their faces, backing out of the bank. One held a canvas sack, another brandished a shotgun, herding a terrified young teller before him. Jedediah was out the door before Miller could utter a word of caution. The sunlight was a physical blow, blinding after the store's gloom. He dropped to one knee behind a water trough, and the rough-hewn wood pressing into his side. The outlaws were moving toward their horses, their movements jerky and nervous. The leader, a tall man with an unnerving stillness about him, gestured for them to mount up. "Sheriff's office is at the other end of town." One of the men yelled, his voice tight with adrenaline. "He'll be too late," the leader replied, his voice calm, cultured, and chillingly out of place amidst the chaos. Jedediah didn't wait for the sheriff. He leveled the Colt, the silver blade of the front sight settling on the chest of the outlaw closest to him, a twitchy man struggling to control his panicked horse. Jedediah's shot was a single deafening crack that echoed off the false fronts of the buildings. The outlaw jerked a look of stunned surprise on his face before slumping from the saddle and hitting the ground in a cloud of red dust. Pandemonium erupted. The remaining outlaws spun, firing wildly. Bullets splintered the water trough, sending shards of wood flying past Jedediah's head. He fired again, the Colt bucking in his hand, a second outlaw crying out and grabbing his arm. The leader calmly raised his own pistol and returned fire, his shot precise, thudding into the trough just inches from Jedediah's face. In the midst of the gunfire, the first man Jedediah had shot tried to push himself up. He clawed at his chest, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. As he did, a small object fell from his shirt pocket, glinting in the harsh sun. It was a silver locket on a delicate chain. The leader saw his man was down for good. With a final dismissive glance, he and the other two spurred their horses, galloping out of town, leaving a wake of dust and terror. The silence that descended was more profound than the noise it replaced. Jedediah rose slowly, his Colt still held ready, his eyes scanning the empty street. Townsfolk began to emerge from their hiding places, their faces pale and drawn. The wounded teller was being helped back inside the bank. Jedediah walked toward the fallen outlaw. The man's eyes were open, staring blankly at the unforgiving sky. His life had fled, leaving only a shell in the dust. But Jedediah's gaze was fixed on the object beside him. He knelt, the dust grinding into his knee, and picked up the silver locket. It was tarnished with age and speckled with blood, but the delicate floral engraving was achingly familiar. His breath caught in his throat. With a trembling thumb, he pressed the clasp. The locket sprang open. Inside, protected beneath a thin piece of scuffed glass, was a faded sepia-toned portrait. It was the face of a young woman, her smile gentle, her eyes full of a light he remembered only in dreams. It was his mother. This was her locket, the one his father had given her on their 10th anniversary, the one he had last seen resting on her dresser, hours before the smoke and the flames had consumed his world. He had always believed it was buried with her, turned to ash and memory in the family plot 20 years ago. The robbery was no longer a simple crime. The outlaws were no longer strangers. This locket, this impossible relic from a buried life, transformed the dusty street into the nexus of his past and present. The ghost he had been running from for 2 decades had just ridden out of town, and now he had no choice but to hunt it down. Sheriff Ben Miller arrived, his face grim, his breathing heavy from the run. He was a man whose shoulders seemed permanently stooped by the weight of his badge. He took in the scene, the body, the blood in the dust, Jedediah standing like a statue staring at something in his hand. Jed Miller said, his voice raspy, "Figure that was your handiwork. Can't seem to stay out of it, can you?" Jedediah didn't look up. He slowly closed the locket, the click of the clasp, sounding like a cell door slamming shut. He felt Miller's presence beside him, the scent of stale coffee and responsibility. "I knew your father," Jed Miller said softly, his gaze on the dead man. "And I knew you when you wore a star. I know what happens when a job gets personal." "It was always personal," Jedediah said, his voice a low gravel. He finally looked at the sheriff, and Miller saw the cold, familiar fire in his eyes, the unforgiving blaze of a U.S. Marshal banked for 20 years but never extinguished. "We've got his body. We'll get a name," Miller said, trying to pull him back toward the methodical, patient path of the law. "We'll send out wires, get a posse together at dawn." "They have a 6-hour lead," Jedediah stated, not as a point of discussion, but as a fact. "A posse will be following cold tracks." "Let the law handle this, Jed," the sheriff pressed, his tone pleading. "Vengeance is a bitter meal. It'll poison you." Jedediah slipped the locket into his breast pocket, the cool metal resting over his heart like a stone. He looked past Miller, his gaze fixed on the shimmering horizon where the outlaws had vanished. The question swirled in his mind, sharp and painful. How did that man have his mother's locket? Who was their leader? Was this all a coincidence? Or was the fire from 20 years ago still burning? He turned and walked toward the livery stable without another word. Miller called after him, "Where are you going?" Jedediah paused, his back to the sheriff. He didn't need to explain the maelstrom of grief and rage that had just been unleashed within him. He didn't need to describe the feeling of his carefully constructed solitude crumbling to dust. There was only one thing that mattered now. "They have something of mine," he said, his voice flat and final. And then he was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the stable. A man once more on a trail, but this time he wasn't hunting for bounty. He was hunting for the truth. An hour later, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, Jedediah rode out of Redemption. He rode east into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The town with its fragile veneer of civilization shrank behind him. Ahead lay only cracked, earth-twisted scrub and the promise of a violent reckoning. He moved not with haste, but with a tracker's measured pace. He found their trail easily, 4 horses, one now riderless, moving fast. He dismounted, crumbling the earth between his fingers. The soil was still warm. They weren't as far ahead as he thought. As twilight bled across the desert, Jedediah made a cold camp in a rocky arroyo. He built no fire, ate a strip of jerky without tasting it, and cleaned his colt by the faint light of the rising moon. The locket remained in his pocket, a cold, heavy weight. He didn't dare look at it again. He didn't need to. The image of his mother's face was burned into his mind, superimposed over the memory of smoke and the smell of burning pine. He remembered being 12 years old, a boy woken by a scream. His father, Elias Kane, a man who seemed to own the world, bellowing in the hallway. Then the heat, the suffocating black smoke. His father had shoved him out a window, yelling at him to run to get help. Jedediah had tumbled into the night, his lungs searing, and watched as his world was eaten by a roaring orange monster. They told him later it was vagrants, a robbery gone wrong. They found 2 bodies in the ashes, not belonging to his family, and the town's benefactors quickly closed the case, protecting the Kane legacy from scandal. Elias Kane had been a pillar of the territory, a man who built things. His tragic death was a wound the community wanted to heal quickly. Jedediah had tried to believe the story. But a part of him, the part that became a lawman, had always felt the jagged edges of the official explanation. It was too neat, too simple. Now that doubt had to face a dead outlaw with his mother's locket. The name the teller had mentioned came back to him. Blackwood. It was a whisper from the deepest recesses of his memory. A name associated with his father, with hushed, angry conversations he'd overheard as a child. A name he couldn't quite place. It felt like trying to grasp smoke. He reassembled his revolver, the familiar clicks of the mechanism, a comforting ritual in the immense silence of the desert. Sheriff Miller was right. Vengeance was a poison. But Jedediah was already poisoned. He had been for 20 years. Now he was simply searching for the antidote or the source of the venom. He didn't care which he found first. He holstered the Colt, lay back against his saddle, and stared up at the indifferent stars. Sleep would not come easily, but determination was its own kind of rest. The hunt had begun. The trail led him through a landscape of escalating desolation. The sparse vegetation gave way to sun-blasted rock and shifting sand. Jedediah followed the tracks with an unwavering focus, reading the story they told in the earth, the gait of the horses, the moments they paused to rest the urgency of their flight. He was a part of this land, his senses honed to its subtle language. After 2 days of hard riding, the trail brought him to the edge of Dust Devil Gulch, a mining town, clinging to the side of a barren mountain like a desperate tick. It wasn't a town so much as a collection of ramshackle buildings stained by soot and hopelessness. A thick, sulphurous smoke hung in the air from the copper mine, and the faces of the few people on the street were coated in a fine layer of grime and despair. Jedediah rode in slowly, his eyes taking in everything. The saloon was the only building that showed any signs of life, its bat-wing doors swinging lazily. The sheriff's office was a small, neglected shack with a crooked sign. Men watched him from shadowed doorways, their gazes hostile and suspicious. This was a town that didn't welcome strangers. It was a place where secrets were kept under lock and key. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office and stepped inside. A young man barely out of his teens sat behind a cluttered desk, a tin star pinned crookedly to his vest. He had a shock of sandy hair and the wary eyes of a cornered rabbit. "Looking for the sheriff," Jedediah said, his voice filling the small room. "You found him," the young man replied, trying to inject a note of authority into his voice that wasn't there. "Deputy Eli Vance. Sheriff's in Tucson for the week. What's your business?" "Tracking 3 men. Rode in here about a day ago. One of them is tall, speaks well. They call him Blackwood." Eli's face went pale. He nervously shuffled some papers on his desk, avoiding Jedediah's gaze. "Ain't seen anyone like that. Folks keep to themselves here." The lie was as plain as the fear on his face. Jedediah leaned forward, placing his palms flat on the desk. The wood creaked under his weight. "Listen to me, Deputy," he said, his voice low and even. "These men robbed the bank in Redemption and killed a man. They're dangerous. And they're here. I can smell the fear in this town. Now you can either help me, or you can get out of my way. But I'm not leaving until I find them." Eli swallowed hard. "You don't understand. Blackwood. He runs things here. The mine, the saloon. People are scared. I can't protect them if I cross him." "He won't be running anything when he's swinging from a rope," Jedediah said coldly. "Where is he?" Eli shook his head, his eyes pleading. "I can't. They'll kill me. They'll burn this town to the ground." Jedediah saw there was no point in pressing him further. The deputy was too terrified to be of any use. He turned and left the office, the young lawman's fear clinging to him like the town's dust. He would have to do this himself. He spent the rest of the day observing. He took a room at the boarding house, a filthy place that smelled of stale beer and regret. From his window, he watched the comings and goings on the street. He saw Blackwood's men. He recognized one of them from the robbery, strutting with an unearned confidence, collecting protection money from the local merchants. That evening, he went to the saloon. The place was crowded with exhausted miners drinking away their meager pay. Blackwood's men were at a table in the back, laughing and drinking whiskey. Blackwood himself was not among them. Jedediah took a seat at the bar, ordered a beer, and listened. The conversations around him were hushed and fearful. He heard whispers of Blackwood's name, of his ruthlessness, of how he'd taken over the mine from its previous owner, a man who had conveniently disappeared. Later, as one of Blackwood's thugs, a burly man with a broken nose, was harassing a barmaid, Jedediah intervened. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped between them. "She's not interested," he said quietly. The thug sneered. "This ain't your concern, old man." He shoved Jedediah, expecting him to stumble. But Jedediah was like a rooted oak. He absorbed the push without moving an inch. Then, with lightning speed, he grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it, and slammed his arm down on the bar. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud, cutting through the saloon's noise. The thug screamed, clutching his broken arm. Silence fell. Every eye was on Jedediah. He met their gazes without flinching, his expression a mask of cold resolve. He had made his statement. He returned to his room, knowing he had forced Blackwood's hand. He wouldn't have to wait long. Just after midnight, his door splintered open. 2 of Blackwood's men burst in, guns drawn. But Jedediah wasn't there. He was waiting in the darkened hallway. He dispatched the first man with the butt of his pistol and disarmed the second before he could even register what was happening. He dragged the conscious one back into the room and tied him to a chair. "Where is he?" Jedediah demanded, pressing the cold barrel of his Colt to the man's temple. The man, trembling, finally broke. He's at the old assay office, at the edge of town." Suddenly, the door creaked open again. Deputy Eli stood there, his own gun drawn, his hand shaking so badly he could barely aim it. I heard the commotion," he stammered. Jedediah didn't lower his weapon. "I told you to stay out of this." "I can't," Eli said, his voice gaining a sliver of conviction. "This is my town." I took an oath. He looked at the bound outlaw, then at Jedediah. "You were right. Fear isn't a good enough reason to let them win." A flicker of respect passed through Jedediah. The boy had a spine, after all. "All right, deputy, you can watch my back. But you do exactly as I say." Eli nodded, his fear still present, but now overshadowed by newfound determination. They left the outlaw tied up and moved through the darkened streets toward the assay office. The building was set apart from the others, a solitary structure against the moonlit mountain. A single lamp burned in the window. They approached from the rear, moving like shadows. Jedediah peered through a grimy window. Inside he saw him, Silas Blackwood. He was seated at a large desk, studying a map. He was tall and lean, dressed in a black frock coat that was surprisingly clean for this town. He had an air of dark charisma, his face handsome but marked by a cold intelligence. He was humming a soft melodic tune that sent a chill down Jedediah's spine. It was the lullaby. His mother's lullaby. The sight of him, the sound of that song, solidified Jedediah's resolve into something as hard and sharp as obsidian. This was the man. This was the ghost he was hunting. They stormed the office. Blackwood was preternaturally calm. He didn't even seem surprised. As Jedediah kicked the door in, Blackwood simply looked up from his map and smiled, a thin, cruel curve of his lips. "Jedediah Kane," he said, his voice as smooth as polished stone, "I was wondering when you'd arrive." The chase across the territory became a grim education for Jedediah. After escaping the trap in Dust Devil Gulch, Blackwood had sacrificed his men to cover his own retreat. Jedediah and a newly emboldened Deputy Eli were always one step behind. But with each town they passed through, each abandoned campsite, they discovered a disturbing pattern began to take shape. Blackwood wasn't moving like a man on the run. He was moving with purpose, like a man on a pilgrimage. His targets were not chosen at random. In the town of Juniper Creek, he didn't rob the bank. He torched the land deed office, but only after stealing a specific set of records. Jedediah, using the authority of his old martial status, which Eli's presence seemed to reawaken, gained access to the surviving county ledgers. The stolen deeds all pertained to land holdings, mines, and freight lines once owned by his father, Elias Kane. "He's not just running," Eli observed one night as they studied a map by campfire light. "He's erasing him. Your father. It's like he's pulling his empire down stone by stone." Jedediah merely grunted in response, but the deputy's words resonated with the cold dread growing in his gut. This was more than revenge. It was a systematic desecration of his family's name. The question was why. The name Blackwood still tormented him, a phantom from his childhood he couldn't grasp. The pursuit led them into the unforgiving expanse of the Salt River Canyon. The days were a furnace, the nights a chilling void. Jedediah taught Eli the subtle arts of tracking, how to read a broken twig, a displaced stone, the depth of a hoofprint in the sand. The young deputy was a quick study, his initial fear replaced by a quiet, steady competence. He watched Jedediah with a mixture of awe and concern, seeing the obsessive fire that drove him. One evening, they cornered the last of Blackwood's original gang in a narrow box canyon. The outlaw, the same one who'd been wounded in the arm during the Redemption robbery, was desperate. A brief, brutal firefight ensued. When the smoke cleared, the man was down, bleeding out behind a rock. Jedediah approached him, his face a hard mask. "Blackwood, where is he going?" The man coughed, blood flecking his lips. He looked at Jedediah with a strange, pitying expression. "You still don't know, do you? He knew you'd come. He's been waiting for you his whole life." He let out a rattling laugh. "He's not erasing your father, Cain. He's finishing a conversation they started a long time ago." Before Jedediah could ask more, the man's eyes glazed over, and he was gone. The outlaw's words were a riddle that coiled around Jedediah's thoughts. Finishing a conversation. It made no sense. Their break came in a small, wind-beaten trading post near the Tonto Basin. The proprietor, a grizzled old man, recognized Jedediah's description of Blackwood. "Yeah, he was here," the old man said, spitting tobacco juice into a dusty spittoon. "Strange fellow. Didn't buy much, just a map and some paper. Spent a long time looking at that old abandoned ranch up on the ridge. The old Blackwood place." Jedediah froze. "The what?" "The Blackwood place," the man repeated. "Belonged to a fella named Thomas Blackwood years ago. Had a partnership with some bigwig from up north. Cain, I think his name was. Heard Cain ruined him. Drove him out of business. The family just disappeared after that. The place has been rotting ever since." The pieces slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. Thomas Blackwood. Silas Blackwood. Cain. The hushed arguments he'd overheard as a boy. His father's angry, dismissive tone. The name was no longer a ghost. It was a flesh-and-blood tragedy. Eli Jedediah set his voice tight. "We're heading for that ranch." He knew now, this wasn't just a hunt, it was an appointment. They rode hard, the landscape growing more familiar as they neared the lands his father had once controlled. They found the turnoff to the old Blackwood ranch, a barely there trail overgrown with creosote and mesquite. At the end of it stood a derelict ranch house, its spine broken, its windows like vacant eyes. In a dusty, rat-infested office, they found what Blackwood had left for them. An old iron lockbox sat on the floor, pried open. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Jedediah's hands trembled as he untied the ribbon. The letters were correspondence between his father, Elias Cain, and Thomas Blackwood. He read them under the fading light, filtering through the grimy window, Eli looking on in silence. The early letters spoke of optimism and shared ambition, two partners building a future. But the tone quickly soured. Elias's letters became demanding, then threatening. He wrote of leveraged assets, of contractual loopholes, of a ruthless predatory strategy to seize control. The final letter wasn't from either man. It was written in a delicate feminine hand from a woman named Eleanor Blackwood to her sister. It was a letter of pure despair. She wrote of her husband Thomas's ruin at the hands of Elias Cain, a man he had once called his friend. She wrote of their humiliation, their poverty. And in the last tear-blotted paragraph, she wrote of finding her husband in the barn, having taken his own life. Jedediah dropped the letters as if they were on fire. The truth was more monstrous than he could have imagined. His father, the man he had idolized and spent 20 years mourning, was not a victim. He was a villain, a man whose greed had destroyed another family. And Silas Blackwood was the surviving son, a boy orphaned by Elias Cain's ambition. Suddenly, the world tilted on its axis. His quest for justice felt like a hollow mockery. He was not the avenging son of a martyred father. He was the heir to a legacy of cruelty and sin. He was hunting a man whose grievance was in its own twisted way entirely justified. "Jedediah," Eli asked softly, seeing the profound shock on his face. Jedediah couldn't speak. He stared at the letters, at the proof of his father's sins lying in the dust. He now understood the locket, the lullaby, the systematic destruction. Silas wasn't just seeking revenge for his father's death. He was seeking retribution for his entire stolen life. The lullaby his mother used to sing, Eleanor Blackwood, must have learned it from Jedediah's mother, back when their families were friends before the poison of greed had ruined everything. The locket hadn't been stolen during the fire. It had likely been taken by Silas's mother that fateful night, a small, desperate memento of a friendship that had been betrayed. The manhunt was over. This was now a direct confrontation with the ghosts of two families, and Jedediah was standing squarely in the middle, armed with a truth that offered no comfort, only a deeper, more profound pain. His entire life, his entire motivation for becoming a lawman and then a tracker had been built on a lie, and now the man who knew the whole ugly story was waiting for him. Silas knew he would find the letters. He had led him here for this very purpose, to arm him with the terrible truth before their final meeting. The understanding settled in Jedediah's gut. With the cold weight of lead, Blackwood's next destination would be the most personal of all. He was going to the one place where all the ghosts of the past converged. "He's going home," Jedediah said, his voice hollow. "To my home." He raced out of the derelict ranch house, Eli close behind. They mounted their horses and spurred them into a gallop, riding toward the ashes of the Kane homestead. Jedediah rode not with the fire of vengeance now, but with the cold dread of a man about to face judgment for sins that were not his own, but had nonetheless defined his entire existence. Knowing Silas's destination was one thing. Anticipating his welcome was another. Jedediah rode with a grim certainty, the wind whipping at his face, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. The sky to the west was bruising a dark wall of clouds gathering for a storm. It was a fitting backdrop for the confrontation to come. He outpaced Eli, his need to reach the homestead a physical ache. As he crested the final ridge, he saw it. The skeletal remains of his childhood home, a collection of charred timbers, and a single defiant stone chimney silhouetted against the turbulent sky. It was a monument to a night of fire and loss, a place he had not visited in 20 years. He dismounted and approached on foot, his boots crunching on the gravel of the old driveway. The air was thick with memory, with the phantom sounds of his sister's laughter and his mother's voice. This was where his life had broken in two. He moved through the ruins, a ghost in his own graveyard. The foundation was a square of weeds and ash. He ran his hand over the rough, soot-stained stones of the fireplace. This was where his family had gathered on cold nights, a place of warmth and safety that had become their tomb. And it was a trap. The first shot came from the skeletal remains of the upper floor, a high-powered rifle crack that sent a puff of stone dust erupting from the chimney next to his head. Jedediah dove behind the hearth, drawing his Colt in a single fluid motion. A second shot splintered the spot where he had been standing. This wasn't Silas. The shots were too wild, too panicked. This was an ambush by what was left of his hired guns, a final obstacle. "Give it up, Kane," a voice shouted from the ruins of the barn. "Blackwood wants you alive, but he didn't say in how many pieces." Jedediah didn't answer. He remained still, listening, his senses alive. He heard the scuff of a boot on charred wood to his left, the nervous cough of a man in the barn to his right. Two of them, maybe three. He was a lawman again, his mind clear and cold, all emotion suppressed in favor of tactical survival. He waited for a lull, then burst from behind the chimney, firing two quick shots toward the barn, not to hit, but to suppress. As the man in the barn ducked for cover, Jedediah scrambled over a collapsed wall and into the blackened remains of the kitchen. The fight was brutal and short. It was a close-quarters battle fought in the labyrinth of his own dead memories. He moved through the wreckage of his home with a deadly grace, using the shadows and ruins as his allies. He took down the man in the barn with a non-lethal shot to the leg. The second man, the rifleman, was more difficult. He was perched in the precarious frame of what was once Jedediah's bedroom. The irony was a bitter pill. He was fighting for his life in the very spot where he used to sleep, where he used to dream of a future that had never come to pass. He climbed the creaking, half-burnt staircase, the wood groaning in protest. The rifleman saw him coming and turned, but he was too slow. Jedediah closed the distance, the ensuing struggle a desperate flurry of limbs and grunts. They crashed through the rotten floorboards, landing in a heap of splintered wood and ash on the ground floor. Jedediah came out on top, his pistol pressed under the man's chin. The fight was over. The two surviving gunmen were disarmed and bound. But Silas was not there. Then he saw it, scratched into the soot-blackened face of the hearthstone. The place that had been the heart of his home was a single, freshly carved word: justice. It was a message, a challenge, a final invitation. Silas had forced him to walk through the ashes of his past, to fight amidst the ghosts of his family, shall to deliver this one mocking word. He was telling Jedediah that this was not about vengeance. It was a righteous reckoning. Eli finally arrived, breathless, his horse lathered. He took in the scene, the bound men, the exhaustion and fresh layer of grime on Jedediah. "Where is he?" Eli asked. Jedediah stared at the word on the stone. He knew where Silas would be. There was only one place left that held meaning for both their families. A place built for redemption, now destined for a final judgment. The old mission church. Jedediah set his voice flat. The one that burned down 10 years back. Our families helped build it, his and mine. The approaching storm was no longer just a threat on the horizon. It was a living entity. The wind began to howl, picking up dust and debris, whipping it into stinging clouds. The sky was the color of a deep purple bruise. Jedediah left the prisoners for Eli to handle. "Take them to the nearest town and wire Sheriff Miller. Tell him what's happened. Tell him where I've gone." "You can't face him alone," Eli protested. "Wait for the posse." "There's no time," Jedediah said, turning to his horse. "This storm is going to wipe out everything. It's now or never." He looked at the young deputy, the fear in his eyes, now replaced with the hard-won steel of a true lawman. "You've done good, Eli. Now go. Do your duty." He mounted up and rode toward the mesa, the wind at his back, pushing him toward his fate. He rode toward a burnt-out church, a place of sanctuary turned to ruin, to face a man who was both his enemy and a mirror of his own loss, ready to finally hear the end of a story that began in fire long ago. The skeletal remains of the mission of San Esteban stood on a wind-swept mesa, a jagged silhouette against the roiling, bruised sky. The wind howled through the empty arches of its stained glass windows, a mournful cry that seemed to emanate from the very stones. Dust, thick and red, swirled like angry spirits, obscuring the world beyond the church's crumbling walls. This was the eye of the storm, a pocket of violent stillness before the true fury was unleashed. Jedediah dismounted his horse, shifting nervously, its eyes wide with fear of the coming tempest. He tied the reins to a gnarled, dead tree and walked toward the yawning, doorless entrance of the church. His duster whipped around him, the storm trying to push him back to deny him this final confrontation. He drew his Colt, its weight of familiar comfort in his hand, and stepped inside. Silas Blackwood was waiting for him at the altar. He stood bathed in the dim, apocalyptic light, filtering through the broken rose window above dust motes dancing around him like a profane halo. He was calm, his hands clasped behind his back, looking more like a preacher preparing for a sermon than an outlaw cornered for a final showdown. "Welcome, Jedediah Silas," said his voice, carrying easily over the rising shriek of the wind. "I knew you would come." The son of Elias Cain was never one to abandon a debt. "This ends now, Blackwood." Jedediah set his voice low and hard. He advanced slowly down the nave, his boots crunching on fallen plaster and broken glass. "It ended 20 years ago." Silas countered a flicker of profound sadness in his eyes. This is merely the epilogue. The part where the truth is finally spoken aloud before the pages are closed for good." He took a step forward away from the altar. He was unarmed, his gun belt coiled neatly on the stone slab behind him. It was a deliberate gesture, a sign that this would begin with words, not bullets. "You found the letters," Silas stated. "It wasn't a question. You saw the man your father truly was. Not a pillar of the community, not a victim, a thief, a man who built his fortune on the ruins of my family. He destroyed your father." Jedediah acknowledged the words, tasting like ash. "That doesn't justify what you've done, the men you've killed." A bitter, humorless smile touched Silas's lips. "Justice is rarely clean, is it? Your father taught me that. But you have it wrong. I never sought to justify, only to balance the scales. He took everything from us, our land, our name, our future. So I took what was left of his legacy. A bank built on his stolen money. Deeds to land he cheated my father out of. I unmade what he made." The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, striking the stone floor with sharp percussive ticks. The storm was breaking. "And the fire?" Jedediah asked the question that had haunted him for 2 decades, hanging between them. "My mother, my sister." Silas's composure finally cracked. His face contorted with a grief so raw, so ancient, it seemed to physically pain him. "You think this was about vengeance for my father alone?" "I was there, Jedediah. I was a boy no older than you. My father, broken and desperate, went to your home that night. Not to rob you, to plead. He took me and my mother with him, hoping the sight of his family would move your father's stone heart." He paced before the altar, the memories pouring out of him. Your father laughed at him. He called him weak. An argument erupted. Your father struck mine. My mother screamed. A lamp was knocked over. A single overturned lamp. His voice dropped to a whisper. It was so fast. The curtains, the whole room just exploded. Your father, Elias, he did not try to save anyone. He grabbed you and threw you out a window. He saved his heir, his legacy. Silas looked at Jedediah, his eyes burning with a righteous fire. My father died trying to get to the stairs. And my mother. She ran back inside, back into the furnace. She heard your sister crying. Jedediah felt the ground beneath him give way. The story he had built his life upon shattered into a million pieces. My mother died in that house, Jedediah Silas said, his voice breaking. She died trying to save your sister, while your heroic father saved only himself. I was pulled from the flames by one of our ranch hands who had followed us. The men your father's friends claimed were vagrants, were my family's employees dead because they tried to help. The official story was a lie buried under the weight of cane money and influence to protect a monster's reputation. The wind howled and the rain came down in sheets, blurring the world outside into a gray chaos. The church groaned around them, a wounded beast on the verge of collapse. The locket, Jedediah breathed, his mind reeling. My mother took it from your house that night, Silas confirmed. A final foolish token of a friendship your father betrayed. She gave it to one of our men to hold just before she went back inside. He kept it all these years. It was all I had left of any of them. The entire edifice of Jedediah's life, his grief, his vengeance, his identity as the son of a murdered man, was a lie. He was the son of the man who started the fire. He had been hunting a man who had suffered the exact same loss, yet a loss orchestrated by his own family. "So what now?" Jedediah asked, his voice hollow. The Colt in his hand felt impossibly heavy. "You kill me. Finish the feud our fathers started." Silas shook his head slowly. He walked back to the altar and picked up his gun belt. He didn't buckle it on, he just held it. "No. I brought you here to face the truth. Your life has been a hunt for a ghost that never was. My life has been a dedication to a truth no one would hear. We are two sides of the same ruined coin, Jedediah. I am done. I have unwritten my family's ending. Now you must write yours." He tossed the gun belt to the floor between them. "Finish what our fathers started, Cain. Avenge the man you thought he was. Become the monster he truly was. Or walk away and let the ghosts rest." The moral dilemma was absolute. Kill Silas and perpetuate the cycle of blood and lies, or let him go and betray the law he once served. But there was a third option, the one he had learned again from a young deputy in a dusty town. "I'm not my father, Jedediah," said his voice ringing with a newfound clarity. He raised his Colt, but he didn't aim it at Silas's heart. He aimed it at the bell rope, old and frayed, that hung from the rafters. He fired. The rope snapped. The great iron bell, silent for a decade, came crashing down, shattering a section of the floor and sending up a cloud of dust and splinters, blocking Silas's path of retreat. At that moment, a section of the weakened roof gave way under the assault of the storm. A torrent of rain and timber crashed down between them. Silas, startled, lunged for his fallen gun. Jedediah was faster. He charged through the debris, a man not of vengeance, but of law. The fight was not one of hatred, but of desperate, grim necessity. It was a brutal, close-quarters struggle in the heart of the storm, two men broken by the same tragedy, finally closing the circle. They crashed against the stone altar, their grunts and the impact of their blows lost in the roar of the wind. Jedediah was stronger. He was fueled by a lifetime of hard miles and harder truths. He subdued Silas, wrenching his arm behind his back, forcing him to the ground. He held him there, panting the rain, soaking them both, washing away the dust and blood, and perhaps the sins of their fathers. It wasn't a victory. It was an end. He had not killed him. He had not walked away. He had chosen justice, the difficult kind. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and silent. The dawn broke, casting a pale, gentle light over the sodden landscape. The air smelled of wet earth and creosote. In the ruins of the mission of San Esteban, Jedediah Cain sat beside a bound and defeated Silas Blackwood, waiting. They didn't have to wait long. A posse led by Sheriff Miller and a determined-looking Deputy Eli crested the mesa. They had followed Jedediah's trail, a path of instinct and hope that the storm hadn't quite managed to erase. Eli was the first to dismount, his relief palpable. "Jedediah, we saw the dust cloud. We thought—" "It's over, Eli," Jedediah said, his voice weary but firm. Sheriff Miller approached his old eyes, taking in the scene, the two men, the devastation of the church, the quiet finality of it all. He looked at Silas, then at Jedediah. No questions were needed. He could read the entire tragic story in their faces. "You did it?" Jed Miller said softly, clapping a hand on his shoulder. Jedediah stood, his joints aching. He looked at Silas, who stared back not with hatred, but with a strange, hollow acceptance. He's yours. He needs to stand trial. The whole story needs to come out. Justice Miller affirmed with a solemn nod, not the easy kind. The return to redemption was a quiet affair. There were no celebrations, no accolades. The townsfolk saw Jedediah ride in a changed man, and the obsessive fire in his eyes replaced by a deep, somber exhaustion. He had found what he was looking for, but it was not the simple truth he had expected. It was a heavy, complicated burden. He met with Sheriff Miller in his office, the two of them sitting in silence for a long time. Finally, Jedediah spoke, his voice low. "My father. The things he did." "People are complicated," Jed Miller said, looking out the window at the town, slowly coming back to life. "Good men do bad things. Bad men sometimes have good reasons. All we can do is deal with the aftermath. You did that. You chose the law over blood. That's a legacy Elias Kane could never have claimed." Jedediah nodded slowly. The words offered a small measure of peace. He had not redeemed his father's name, but he had refused to be defined by his sins. A few days later, Jedediah rode out to the old Kane family plot. It was on a small hill overlooking a valley neglected and overgrown, and the iron fence around it rusted and broken. The headstones of his parents and sister were weathered, their names barely legible. He stood before his mother's grave for a long time. He took the silver locket from his pocket, its surface now polished, gleaming in the morning sun. He had spent hours cleaning it, restoring it. He held it for a moment, a tangible piece of a life built on a lie. But it was also a reminder of his mother, a woman who in the end had been a victim of the same greed as the Blackwoods. With a sense of finality, he gently placed the locket on the cold granite of her headstone, leaving the past where it belonged. He then found a rusted set of tools in a collapsed shed nearby. He spent the rest of the day in quiet, arduous labor, mending the broken fence. He replaced the rusted hinges on the gate, pulled the weeds from the graves, and reset a stone that had fallen. It was not an act of honor for the man his father was, but an act of peace for the family he had lost. It was a quiet, symbolic act of forgiveness and renewal. He was no longer a prisoner of this place. He was its caretaker. As he was preparing to leave the sun low in the sky, he saw a rider approaching. It was Eli. The young man sat taller in the saddle, his face carrying a new confidence. And pinned to his chest, shining brightly, was the star of a U.S. Marshal. Marshal Jedediah said, a small, weary smile touching his lips. "I took the oath yesterday," Eli said, his voice filled with pride. "Sheriff Miller sent a wire to the territorial judge. Told him all about what happened. About you. He said the territory needed more men who understood that justice isn't about vengeance." He looked at Jedediah, his expression earnest. "You inspired me, Jedediah. You showed me what a lawman is supposed to be." Jedediah looked from the newly mended fence to the young marshal. He saw then that his legacy would not be his father's dark ambition or his own 2 decades of bitter grief. His legacy was this: a young man choosing the harder path, a cycle of violence broken, a future built on law and hope. He gave Eli a single deep nod of acknowledgement. He mounted his horse, the leather creaking under his weight. He did not look back at the graves, at the town in the distance, or at the young lawman who now carried the torch. He turned his horse toward the open country, toward the setting sun that painted the vast, empty canvas of the West, with the promise of a new day. He rode away no longer a ghost of the past, but a man finally and truly ready to face a new dawn.